How do you destroy an empire that seems unstoppable? How do you break an army of 200,000 battle-hardened warriors who have conquered half of Europe and Asia? On July 20th, 1402, near the plains of Ankara, the mighty Ottoman Empire, a force that had crushed Byzantine armies, subjugated the Balkans, and made Christian Europe tremble, faced something they had never encountered before. They faced Timur the Lame, a Turco-Mongol conqueror who had already turned cities into pyramids of skulls and kings into footstools. The Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I, known as the Thunderbolt for his lightning-fast campaigns, commanded an army so vast that its camp stretched for miles across the Anatolian plateau. His soldiers had never known defeat under his banner. They believed themselves invincible. But what happened on that scorching summer day would prove that even thunder can be silenced. What secret did Timur possess that allowed him to not just defeat, but utterly annihilate an Ottoman force that outnumbered many European kingdoms? The answer lies in a campaign of psychological warfare, tactical brilliance, and sheer brutality that would reshape the entire Middle East for generations to come. To understand the magnitude of this catastrophe, we must first grasp what the Ottoman Empire represented in 1402. Under Bayezid I, who had ruled since 1389, the Ottomans had become the nightmare of Christendom. When Bayezid ascended to power, he immediately proved his ruthless efficiency by ordering his own brothers strangled, a grim Ottoman tradition to prevent civil war. He then turned his attention to conquest with terrifying speed. In 1396, at the Battle of Nicopolis, Bayezid had crushed a massive crusader army of over 100,000 warriors assembled from France, Hungary, England, and the German states. The flower of European chivalry lay dead on the battlefield, with casualty estimates reaching 70,000 men. King Sigismund of Hungary barely escaped by boat down the Danube. The survivors who were captured faced Bayezid's wrath. He personally oversaw the execution of 3,000 prisoners, making them kneel in rows as Ottoman swords fell upon their necks. Constantinople itself trembled behind its ancient walls, knowing it was only a matter of time before Bayezid's armies would breach them. The Byzantine Emperor Manuel II personally traveled to Western Europe, begging for help against this unstoppable force. The Ottomans controlled the Balkans, threatened Hungary, and had reduced the once mighty Byzantine Empire to little more than the city of Constantinople and a few scattered territories. Bayezid's military machine seemed invincible. A perfectly organized force combining the discipline of Turkish Ghazis, Serbian heavy cavalry, Janissary infantry, and vassals from across his empire. They had siege experience, battlefield prowess, and a commander who had earned his fearsome nickname through never allowing an enemy time to prepare. But far to the east, beyond the mountains of Persia, another storm was gathering. Timur, known to Europeans as Tamerlane, had built an empire that made the Ottomans look modest by comparison. Born in 1336 in Transoxiana, Timur had risen from minor nobility to controlled territory stretching from Delhi to Damascus, from the Volga River to the Persian Gulf. His conquests had been marked by calculated terror on a scale that defied imagination. When the city of Isfahan rebelled against his rule in 1387, Timur's response was methodical genocide. His armies systematically killed approximately 70,000 inhabitants and built 28 towers from their skulls. Each tower constructed from 1,500 heads, mortared together with lime. When Delhi fell to his forces in 1398, his soldiers slaughtered 100,000 prisoners in a single day before the main assault, fearing they might rebel during the battle. The city burned for days, and contemporary chroniclers recorded that not even a bird dared to fly over Delhi's ruins for months afterward. In 1400, Timur's armies descended upon the great Syrian city of Aleppo. And after its fall, 20,000 of its citizens had their heads stacked in pyramids at the city gates. Baghdad suffered even worse in 1401. After a 3-month siege, Timur ordered each of his 90,000 soldiers to bring him at least 2 severed heads. The result was 120 towers of skulls, each containing 1,500 heads, creating a forest of death visible for miles. Damascus, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on earth, surrendered to avoid Aleppo's fate, only to be systematically looted anyway, with its master craftsmen deported to Timur's capital of Samarkand. Timur's military genius lay not in brute force alone, but in psychological warfare and tactical flexibility. His army, numbering roughly 140,000 at Ankara, was organized in the Mongol fashion with devastating effectiveness. Light cavalry armed with composite bows could rain arrows while galloping at full speed. Heavy cavalry wore lamellar armor and could punch through enemy formations. His forces included war elephants from his Indian campaigns, specialists in siege warfare from China, and warriors from dozens of conquered peoples. Unlike European or Ottoman armies, Timur's force could move with incredible speed, covering 90 miles in 2 days when necessary, and could fight effectively in any terrain from mountains to deserts. He used extensive intelligence networks, sending spies disguised as merchants and dervishes to gather information on enemy movements, morale, and internal politics. Most importantly, Timur understood that battles were won before the first arrow was fired. Through exhaustion, dehydration, starvation, and despair. The collision between these two conquerors became inevitable through a combination of ambition and circumstance. Timur had been systematically conquering the Middle East, claiming to be the restorer of Mongol greatness and the champion of Islam. The Ottoman Empire's rapid expansion westward had created a power that could challenge his claim to supremacy. The spark came when Bayezid offered sanctuary to various regional rulers fleeing from Timur's advance, including princes from the Anatolian beyliks that the Ottomans had previously conquered, but which Timur now claimed as his vassals. Among these refugees was Sultan Ahmad Jalayir of Baghdad, whose lands Timur had just devastated. Bayezid's refusal to hand over these princes was a direct challenge to Timur's authority. The exchange of letters between the two rulers drips with contempt and threat. Timur addressed Bayezid as the chief of the frontier warriors, while styling himself conqueror of the world. Bayezid, with characteristic boldness, responded by calling Timur the Mongol bandit, and boasting that he would soon be keeping his harem in cages. This was more than diplomatic posturing. It was a declaration that only one of these empires would survive. In the spring of 1402, Timur's armies began their advance into Anatolia from the east. His initial strategy revealed his strategic genius immediately. Rather than marching directly toward the Ottoman heartland, he moved with incredible speed to capture Sivas in late June 1402, a major Ottoman stronghold in eastern Anatolia. The garrison of 4,000 men fought bravely, but stood no chance against Timur's overwhelming numbers and siege experience. When the city fell, Timur demonstrated his trademark cruelty. The garrison soldiers were buried alive, and 3,000 Armenian Christian inhabitants were burned alive in what the chroniclers called a message to those who resist. But the strategic purpose was more important than the terror. By taking Sivas, Timur cut Ottoman communications and supply lines. More crucially, he was drawing Bayezid eastward, away from his power base and into terrain that Timur could control. Bayezid, true to his Thunderbolt nickname, couldn't resist the challenge. He mobilized his entire army and began a forced march eastward to confront the invader. This was exactly what Timur wanted. The Ottoman army was leaving behind its fortifications, its supply depots, and the European territories where reinforcements could easily arrive. Bayezid wasn't ignorant of Timur's reputation, but his pride and his strategic situation gave him little choice. The Ottoman Empire's legitimacy rested on continuous conquest and the Sultan's image of invincibility. To avoid battle would be to show weakness, potentially triggering rebellions among newly conquered subjects. Moreover, Bayezid had genuine reasons for confidence. His army assembled near Ankara numbered approximately 200,000 men, though modern historians debate whether the fighting strength was closer to 85,000 to 120,000 when excluding camp followers and support personnel. The core of his force consisted of 15,000 elite janissaries, Christian boys taken as children, converted to Islam, and trained as professional infantry. These men were armed with swords, bows, and early firearms, called arquebuses. They had never broken in battle. Bayezid also commanded about 30,000 Sipahi cavalry, Ottoman Turks who held land grants in exchange for military service. These were supplemented by Serbian heavy cavalry under the Ottoman vassal Stefan Lazarević, considered some of the finest armored horsemen in Europe, numbering around 5,000. Additionally, there were Anatolian Turkish auxiliary cavalry from the Beyliks, though their loyalty was questionable since many had been forcibly incorporated into the Ottoman Empire. Bayezid also brought European vassals, giving him a diverse but potentially fragmented force. As Bayezid's army approached Ankara in mid-July, Timur demonstrated why he was perhaps history's greatest master of operational-level warfare. Rather than accepting battle immediately, he maneuvered his entire army to position himself between Bayezid's force and the vital water sources in the region. The summer of 1402 was brutally hot, even by Anatolian standards, and Timur knew that the true enemy wasn't just the Ottoman army, but thirst and exhaustion. He positioned his forces near the Chubuk River, controlling access to its waters. When Bayezid arrived and established camp near Ankara on July 18th, his army was already suffering. They had force-marched across Anatolia in the summer heat, and now they found their access to water controlled by the enemy. Timur's men dug trenches and erected field fortifications, something Ottoman armies rarely encountered from steppe warriors. For 2 days, July 18th and 19th, the armies maneuvered and skirmished while Ottoman soldiers grew increasingly desperate for water. Discipline began to fray. Men would break ranks to try to reach water sources, only to be cut down by Timurid cavalry. The psychological pressure was immense. Soldiers could see the river, but couldn't reach it. Meanwhile, Timur's well-supplied troops rested and prepared. Perhaps more devastating was Timur's campaign of psychological subversion. His agents had been working for weeks on the Anatolian Turkish auxiliaries in Bayezid's army, reminding them that they were fighting alongside the Ottomans, who had conquered their independent beyliks, forcing them to serve the very Sultan who had destroyed their autonomy. On the morning of July 20th, 1402, Bayezid realized he had no choice but to fight. His army was weakening by the hour, and retreat would be disastrous given the mobility of Timur's cavalry. The battle would take place on the plains northeast of Ankara, in terrain that favored cavalry maneuver. As dawn broke, both armies deployed in the traditional manner of the era. Timur positioned his forces in the classic Mongol arrangement, a strong center with even stronger wings designed to envelop the enemy. His left wing was commanded by his grandson, Prince Khalil Sultan, and consisted of approximately 40,000 cavalry. The right wing, under Muhammad Sultan, another grandson, held similar numbers. The center, which Timur personally commanded, included his elite guard units, war elephants, and reserve forces. Altogether, Timur deployed roughly 140,000 fighters, though numbers from this era are notoriously difficult to verify with precision. Bayezid countered with his own deployment. His center consisted of the elite Janissary infantry, positioned to hold firm against any assault. His right wing featured Sipahi cavalry and Turkish auxiliaries. The left wing included the Serbian heavy cavalry under Stefan Lazarevic, positioned as the Ottomans' most powerful striking force. The Ottomans had numerical superiority, better heavy infantry, and cavalry that had proven itself in countless battles. On paper, they should have had an excellent chance of victory. The battle opened with the traditional exchange of arrows as light cavalry from both sides skirmished and probed for weaknesses. The sound must have been overwhelming. Tens of thousands of horses, the whistling of arrows filling the air, the shouting of orders in Turkish, Mongolian, Persian, Serbian, and a dozen other languages. Timur's strategy became clear within the first hour. Rather than committing to a full assault, his wings began the classic step tactic of feigned retreats, drawing Ottoman cavalry forward, then wheeling and unleashing devastating arrow volleys before retreating again. This was the tactic that had destroyed Chinese armies, Persian forces, and Indian sultanates. But Bayezid's troops were experienced. They didn't fall for the obvious trap. The Janissaries held their ground with discipline, and the Serbian cavalry remained in formation. For a moment, it seemed the battle might be a grinding stalemate. Then Timur's months of preparation paid off, in the most devastating way possible. The Anatolian Turkish auxiliaries on the Ottoman right wing, already demoralized by thirst and exhausted from days without adequate water, began to waver. These were troops from the beyliks of Karaman, Germiyan, and Saruhan, territories that Bayezid had conquered and forcibly incorporated into his empire. Timur's agents had spent weeks spreading promises that these soldiers would be treated well if they defected, that they would regain their independence, that they were fighting on the wrong side. Now, in the chaos of battle, facing warriors who spoke their language and shared their culture, approximately 15,000 to 20,000 of these auxiliaries suddenly switched sides. They didn't just retreat. They actively turned on their Ottoman commanders, attacking the Sipahi cavalry from behind. This wasn't a mere defection. It was a catastrophic betrayal that shattered the entire Ottoman right wing. Within minutes, the Ottoman line had a gaping hole, and Timur's right-wing cavalry poured through like water through a broken dam. The Serbian cavalry under Stefan Lazarevic, seeing the disaster unfolding, attempted a desperate charge to stabilize the line. These heavily armored knights crashed into Timur's center, and for a brief moment, they achieved what no other force had managed. They pushed back the Timurid guard units. Serbian lances shattered Timurid shields, and horses screamed as they collided in a mass of metal and flesh. But they were isolated, surrounded, and hopelessly outnumbered. After a heroic stand that would be remembered in Serbian epics for centuries, Stefan Lazarevic recognized the battle was lost and cut his way out with the remnants of his cavalry, perhaps 2,000 men, fleeing the battlefield rather than dying in a futile last stand. The Ottoman center now faced envelopment from three sides. The Janissaries, those elite slave soldiers who had never broken, found themselves surrounded by a sea of Timurid cavalry and subjected to a storm of arrows. Unlike European battles where heavily armored knights could shrug off arrows, the lighter armor of the Janissaries offered less protection against the massed archery of Mongol-style compound bows fired at close range. Men began falling in waves. The psychological impact of watching their flanks collapse, of seeing their own auxiliary troops attacking them, of the crushing thirst after days without adequate water. All of it combined to break even these disciplined warriors. Some Janissary units fought to the death where they stood, creating small islands of resistance that were systematically eliminated. Others tried to retreat toward Ankara, only to be ridden down by Timurid cavalry who showed no mercy. The plain became a killing field. Contemporary accounts describe the dust so thick that visibility was reduced to a few yards. Filled with the screams of dying men and horses, the clash of weapons, and the constant hiss of arrows. Bayezid himself, the thunderbolt who had terrorized Europe, found himself in the midst of collapse. Surrounded by his personal guard and a few thousand loyal troops, he attempted to rally his forces and launch a counterattack toward Timur's position. This was pure desperation. A last attempt to turn the battle by killing the enemy commander. It was the kind of bold, aggressive move that had defined Bayezid's entire career. For a moment, it nearly succeeded. The Ottoman Sultan and his guard carved through the Timurid lines with ferocious determination, getting close enough to see Timur's banner. But Timur's reserves, held back for precisely this kind of emergency, counterattacked. Fresh cavalry units slammed into the exhausted Ottoman guard from multiple angles. Bayezid's horse was killed beneath him. Accounts vary on exactly what happened next. Some sources claim Bayezid fought on foot until he was overwhelmed. Others say he was knocked unconscious and captured while trying to escape. What is certain is that by late afternoon, on July 20th, 1402, Sultan Bayezid I, the man who had made Christian Europe tremble, was a prisoner in chains. The battle continued for hours more, as scattered Ottoman units fought on without knowing their sultan had fallen. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The casualty figures from Ankara are staggering, even by the bloody standards of medieval warfare. While exact numbers are impossible to verify, most historical sources suggest that between 40,000 and 50,000 Ottoman soldiers died on the battlefield itself, or in the immediate pursuit afterward. Another 20,000 to 30,000 were captured, many of whom were executed in the days following the battle. When you consider that Bayezid's actual fighting force was likely around 85,000 to 120,000 men, this represents a catastrophic loss of between 50% and 70% of his army. Entire military units ceased to exist. The elite Janissary Corps was decimated, with only a few thousand escaping. The Sipahi cavalry that had conquered the Balkans was shattered. By contrast, Timur's casualties, while significant, were far lighter. Perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 dead and wounded, though reliable figures are even harder to determine for his forces. The battlefield itself became a scene of horror. For days after the battle, Timur's soldiers stripped the dead of anything valuable, leaving thousands of corpses to rot under the Anatolian sun. Scavenger birds darkened the sky. The nearby city of Ankara, which had hoped for Ottoman protection, was stormed and sacked. Timur's troops killed an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 of its inhabitants and enslaved thousands more. But the most dramatic consequence of Ankara was the fate of Bayezid himself. The once mighty sultan was now Timur's prisoner, and the propaganda war was as important as the military victory had been. Various sources describe Bayezid being kept in chains, though the more sensational European accounts that he was carried around in an iron cage are disputed by Islamic historians. What is certain is that Timur treated his captured enemy as a curiosity to display, to visiting dignitaries, and as a warning to other rulers who might challenge him. The psychological impact was devastating. Here was the man who had crushed European crusaders, reduced to a captive. When the news reached Constantinople, there was simultaneous relief that the Ottoman threat was removed and anxiety about what this terrifying new conqueror might do. Western European courts celebrated with Thanksgiving services. Within 8 months of his capture, on March 8, 1403, Bayezid died while still in captivity near Akshehir. The cause of death remains disputed. Some sources claim he committed suicide out of shame, others that he died from illness brought on by depression, and still others suggest he was deliberately poisoned or allowed to die through neglect. Regardless of the specific cause, the man who had been called the Thunderbolt died not in battle, but as a broken prisoner. The immediate aftermath of Ankara saw the Ottoman Empire collapse into chaos. With Bayezid dead and his sons captured or scattered, a civil war erupted that lasted over a decade, from 1402 to 1413. This period, known as the Ottoman Interregnum or Fetret Devri, saw Bayezid's 4 sons, Suleiman, Isa, Mehmed, and Musa, fighting each other for the throne. The territories Bayezid had conquered began to slip away. The Anatolian beyliks that had been forcibly incorporated into the Ottoman Empire reasserted their independence under Timur's protection. Karaman, Germian, Aydin, and others became autonomous again. The Byzantine Empire, which had been on the verge of extinction, suddenly received a reprieve that would last another 50 years. Emperor Manuel II reclaimed some territories and no longer faced immediate existential threat. The Balkans fell into confusion as local rulers questioned whether to remain loyal to a collapsing Ottoman state or to seek independence. Serbia under Stefan Lazarevic actually gained prestige from its performance at Ankara and managed to secure a period of relative autonomy. Timur, meanwhile, continued his campaign through Anatolia for another year. He besieged and captured Smyrna in December 1402, a Christian fortress held by the Knights Hospitaller. After a brutal siege, he ordered the execution of the Christian defenders by beheading and built another of his signature skull pyramids, this time using the heads of European knights. The city was so thoroughly destroyed that it was abandoned for years afterward. He systematically dismantled Ottoman power in Anatolia, redistributing territories to local rulers who acknowledged his supremacy. The region that is now Western Turkey became a patchwork of small states, all theoretically vassals of Timur's empire. However, Timur never capitalized on his victory to destroy the Ottoman Empire completely. His attention turned eastward toward China. He was planning a massive invasion of Ming China, gathering an army that some sources claim would have numbered 200,000 when death intervened. In February 1405, during the march toward China, the 68-year-old conqueror died near Otrar in present-day Kazakhstan. His death triggered the fragmentation of his own empire as his descendants fought over the succession. The long-term consequences of Ankara reshaped the entire region for generations. The Ottoman Empire's recovery took decades, but ultimately succeeded where Timur's empire failed. It developed institutional stability that could survive leadership transitions. Mehmed finally won the civil war among Bayezid's sons in 1413, reuniting the Ottoman territories through a combination of military skill and diplomatic maneuvering. His son Murad II and grandson Mehmed II would rebuild the Ottoman military machine, learning from the disaster at Ankara. When Mehmed II finally conquered Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire forever, he commanded an army that had been reorganized to prevent another catastrophic betrayal like the one at Ankara. The Janissary Corps was rebuilt with even stricter loyalty requirements. The incorporation of Anatolian troops was done more carefully, with better integration and loyalty measures. In a very real sense, the Ottoman Empire that eventually controlled vast territories across 3 continents was forged in the disaster of Ankara. The Byzantine Empire's reprieve, while welcome, ultimately only delayed the inevitable. The 50 years between Ankara and Constantinople's fall allowed for a final flowering of Byzantine culture and gave scholars time to flee westward with classical manuscripts helping to spark the Italian Renaissance. But the empire was too weak, too poor, and too isolated to truly recover. Ankara bought time but couldn't reverse centuries of decline. For the Anatolian beyliks that briefly regained independence, their freedom was temporary. As the Ottomans recovered, they systematically reconquered these territories over the next few decades. And by the mid-15th century, Anatolia was once again united under Ottoman rule, though the memory of the betrayal at Ankara led to harsher integration policies. The Battle of Ankara stands as one of history's most decisive encounters. Not because it ended empires, neither the Ottoman nor Timurid empires were destroyed, but because of how it revealed the fragility of seemingly unstoppable forces. Bayezid's empire appeared invincible until it faced an opponent who understood that battles are won through logistics, intelligence, psychological warfare, and exploiting internal divisions. The 200,000-strong Ottoman army wasn't defeated primarily by Timur's tactical brilliance on the battlefield, though that was considerable. It was defeated by thirst, exhaustion, and betrayal, factors that Timur had carefully orchestrated over weeks of maneuvering. This was warfare elevated to its highest strategic level, where the actual fighting on July 20th was almost an afterthought, the inevitable conclusion of a campaign that had already been won through operational excellence. If Timur had lost at Ankara, if Bayezid's gamble had paid off and the thunderbolt had managed to defeat the Mongol conqueror, the entire course of world history might have shifted. Constantinople would likely have fallen in the early 15th century rather than 1453, cutting short the final preservation of classical knowledge. The Ottoman Empire, flush with victory over history's last great steppe conqueror, might have expanded into Persia and Central Asia, creating an empire stretching from Vienna to India. European history would have faced an even more dominant Ottoman threat a generation earlier, potentially preventing the age of exploration as resources were diverted to defending against Turkish expansion. The Renaissance might have been stillborn if Constantinople fell before Byzantine scholars could flee westward with their manuscripts. Timur's death prevented his planned invasion of China, but an earlier death at Ankara would have spared Central Asia decades of devastation. The legacy of Ankara echoes across the centuries in unexpected ways. The battle demonstrated that even the most powerful military machines could be broken if an opponent understood their internal weaknesses. Timur's exploitation of the Anatolian auxiliaries' resentment created a template for defeating composite empires, turned their diversity from a strength into a fatal vulnerability. The Ottoman recovery from this disaster showed that institutional resilience mattered more than individual battles. While Timur built a personal empire that fragmented at his death, the Ottomans created a system that survived defeats, civil wars, and mediocre sultans to last until 1922. The battle also marked the last great victory of classical steppe cavalry warfare, before gunpowder weapons would revolutionize combat. Within a century, the military techniques that Timur perfected would become obsolete, overtaken by artillery and musket-armed infantry. We remember Ankara today not for the nobility of the combatants or the justice of their causes. Both Bayezid and Timur were brutal conquerors who built empires on mountains of corpses. We remember it because it was a perfect storm of strategic brilliance, meeting tactical opportunity, of psychological warfare, achieving what arrows alone could not. Of one moment when the outcome of the battle reshaped the destiny of nations. The Ottoman soldier, who woke up on the morning of July 20th believing his empire was invincible, went to sleep that night, if he survived, knowing that empires could die in a single afternoon. The Byzantine citizen who feared the Ottomans would breach Constantinople's walls within months, suddenly had decades more of survival. The European monarch who thought the Turkish threat was unstoppable learned that even the thunderbolt could be silenced. And Timur, the last great steppe conqueror, proved that the methods of Genghis Khan could still shatter the most modern military forces, even in the 15th century. Thank you so much for watching this deep dive into one of history's most devastating battles. If you found this exploration of Ankara and the clash between Timur and Bayezid fascinating, please hit that like button and help us reach 1,000 likes in the next 24 hours. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because we're going to keep bringing you these incredible stories of battles that changed history. Drop a comment below, telling us what battle or historical event you want us to cover next. Are you interested in more medieval warfare? Ancient battles? Underdog victories? Let us know, and we'll make it happen. Until next time, remember that history is written by those who understand that war is fought with minds as much as with swords.